The billionaire CEO was on his way to the biggest deal of his life, until he found a crying toddler in his first-class seat, holding a letter with his name on it. Henry Winston moved through the private boarding gate like he had 1,000 times before, efficient, precise, and without emotion. His custom-tailored suit was crisp, his watch synchronized to Tokyo time, and his mind fully absorbed in the negotiation strategy he had mentally rehearsed the entire drive to the airport. This deal would be the biggest of his career. Billions were on the line, not just for the company but for his legacy. Everything had been coordinated to the minute. His assistant had ensured his favorite seat, 13A in first class, was reserved, and his files were loaded onto his tablet, ready for final review during the flight. There was nothing unpredictable about any of it. That was how Henry operated. Control was the foundation of his world. But as he stepped into the cabin and approached row 13, something jolted his routine. His seat was occupied. And not by a fellow executive or a misassigned passenger. A small child, a toddler, maybe 3 years old, was curled up in seat 13A, clutching a stuffed bear and crying softly into the fabric of the seatbelt. He wore a white cotton sweater that looked slightly too big for his tiny frame, and his shoes had clearly been taken off somewhere along the way. His face was flushed from crying, and his wide, tear-filled blue eyes locked onto Henry's with something that made the air catch in Henry's lungs. A flight attendant quickly approached, apologizing with visible confusion. She glanced down at the boy's boarding pass, then back up at Henry. The child's name wasn't listed under any reservation. There was no guardian on the manifest. No check-in alert. No explanation. Yet somehow, this boy had been assigned to seat 13A, Henry's seat. Security was being called. A gate agent was on their way. The captain had been notified. Henry should have been frustrated. He should have insisted on immediate resolution and moved on to another seat, focusing on the billion-dollar deal awaiting him across the ocean. But he didn't. Something stopped him. He didn't understand why, but instead of stepping back, he slowly sat down in seat 13B beside the child, watching him with growing unease. The boy had stopped crying now, but his lips still trembled. Clutched in his hand, almost unnoticed beneath the edge of his sleeve, was a folded piece of paper. A name was scribbled across the front in blue marker, Henry Winston. Henry's chest tightened as he reached out and gently took the letter, unfolding it with growing dread. The handwriting inside was uneven but familiar. He hadn't seen it in years, but he knew it instantly. Eliza. The letter was short, almost rushed, written with a shaking hand. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't go on. I'm sorry. His name is Thomas. He's yours. I had nothing left to give him, but you still have everything. Please don't leave him. For a moment, Henry couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. Eliza. The woman he had once loved but left behind when ambition took priority. They hadn't spoken in years. She had vanished from his life so completely that sometimes he wondered if she had ever really been in it at all. And now she was reaching out, not for herself, but for a child. His child. He looked back at the boy. Thomas. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The shape of his jaw. The curve of his eyebrows. Those bright blue eyes, Henry's mother used to say they were like glass marbles. He had the same. He felt the plane around him fade into the background, the murmurs of confused passengers, the rushed steps of crew members, the mechanical chime of the boarding door. All of it dissolved into a single, undeniable moment. A child had been placed in his seat, with his name on a letter, and no one else in the world coming for him. The flight was grounded. Security needed answers. But Henry wasn't thinking about Tokyo anymore. He was thinking about Eliza, about the choices he'd made, and the boy now resting quietly against the seat with tear stains on his cheeks. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A call. A second chance. And for the first time in years, Henry Winston didn't know what happened next. All he knew was that he wasn't getting on that flight. The terminal was quieter than usual once the flight to Tokyo officially closed its doors without him. Henry sat in a glass-walled observation area overlooking the runway, his suit jacket draped over the armrest of a chair that suddenly felt far too stiff. Thomas was asleep beside him, curled up in a fleece blanket one of the attendants had brought earlier, his head resting gently on Henry's lap. Every now and then, his small hand would twitch, fingers grasping for something even in sleep. Henry didn't move. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't check emails. All he could do was sit there, unmoving, as the weight of the letter burned in his pocket. The gate agents had done their job. They notified the airline security, called in social services, and double-checked the manifest for any trace of guardianship. Nothing turned up. The name, Eliza Morgan, had triggered a match in the system. She had purchased a ticket under her own name weeks earlier, but never boarded. No luggage. No contact. No one waiting on the other end. She had quite literally disappeared, leaving only the boy, the letter, and a signature that Henry hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. The social worker who arrived didn't recognize him at first. He introduced himself politely, clipboard in hand, prepared to follow procedure. But once he heard Henry's name, something shifted. Everyone knew who Henry Winston was. CEO. Public figure. Fortune covers. Forbes lists. The idea that this child, sitting with tear-dried cheeks and unmatched socks, could be his was not something the system was equipped to handle with quiet efficiency. Henry didn't care about protocol. All he wanted was to understand how it had come to this. How Eliza, independent, proud, complicated Eliza, could leave her son, their son, in an airplane seat with nothing but a note and a hope. And maybe, Henry realized, it wasn't really hope. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was love that had run out of places to go. The social worker explained the next steps. Custodial investigation. Emergency placement. Possible DNA confirmation. Paperwork. Court hearings. Henry nodded, understanding the process but already knowing the outcome. He didn't need a test. He could feel it in his bones, in the curve of the boy's cheek, in the instinct that had taken root the moment Thomas looked up at him. This wasn't a stranger's child. This was his son. And he wasn't going to let him vanish into a system. When Thomas woke up, he didn't cry. He simply sat up slowly, blinking at the bright lights above them, and looked at Henry with a strange sort of stillness. There was no fear in his expression. Just exhaustion and confusion, the kind only children who have lived through too much too soon can carry in their eyes. "Are we going home?" he asked, voice barely louder than a whisper. Henry didn't answer right away. The word home struck something deep in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Home wasn't the penthouse with glass walls and a view of the skyline. It wasn't boardrooms or chauffeurs or curated dinners with investors. Home was wherever Thomas felt safe. And if Henry had any chance of becoming that place, he'd take it. "We're going somewhere safe," he said carefully. "Somewhere just for us." He took Thomas's hand, small, warm, still sticky from the juice box he'd been given earlier, and led him out of the terminal. His driver looked startled when he saw them, but didn't ask questions. Henry gave him a new address, one he hadn't said out loud in years. His mother's old house. It was nestled in a quiet neighborhood an hour outside the city, a place he had visited every summer as a boy before life pulled him into the current of ambition. The house had sat empty since she passed, its windows shuttered and garden overgrown. But it was still standing, still full of echoes, and still waiting. That night, Henry laid Thomas down on the old guest-room bed and sat beside him until his breathing steadied into sleep. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't call Tokyo. He just sat there, watching the boy who had arrived in his life like a storm, quiet on the surface, but deep enough to reshape everything. Outside the window, the wind stirred through the tall grass. Inside, Henry Winston, for the first time in his life, did not feel like a man chasing success. He felt like a man trying to become someone worth coming home to. The days that followed moved with an unfamiliar kind of slowness, as if time itself had paused to make room for something entirely new. Henry woke up early each morning, not to check the markets or prepare for a video conference, but because Thomas was stirring in the next room, murmuring softly in his sleep or padding barefoot across the hardwood floors looking for breakfast. The boy's presence filled the quiet house in a way that unsettled and soothed Henry at once. It had been years since he had lived with anyone else. He was used to silence, to perfect order. But now, every surface was slowly being taken over by scattered toys, stray crumbs, and the warm chaos of a child learning to feel safe. Henry made cereal on the first morning. He poured too much milk, used the wrong kind of spoon, and handed it to Thomas without realizing the bowl was freezing from the fridge. The boy didn't complain. He simply sat at the old wooden table, swinging his legs, and ate quietly, glancing up at Henry now and then as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. Henry sat across from him, still in yesterday's shirt, unsure of what to say or do, except that he couldn't look away. Every movement Thomas made felt surreal. It was like watching a distant memory play out in front of him, familiar, yet painfully new. In the afternoon, Henry took Thomas into town to buy him clothes, something warm, shoes that fit. The boy held his hand without being asked. At the store, the clerk tried to make small talk. "Is this your grandson?" And Henry's response caught even him by surprise. "He's my son." The words felt heavy and strange in his mouth, not because they weren't true, but because he had never said them before. He saw Thomas's face turn slightly toward him at that moment, his eyes widening just a little. The boy didn't speak, but something shifted in the air between them, a thin thread of connection pulling tighter. That evening, after Thomas fell asleep curled up on the couch, Henry walked outside into the cool dusk and sat on the front steps of the house, staring at the overgrown garden. He hadn't been back here in so long. The last time, he had been too busy, too impatient, too distracted by things that now felt embarrassingly hollow. He had missed so much. Not just the years he could have had with Eliza, but the little things, the first smile, the first word, the nights with fevers, the early drawings hung proudly on a wall. He thought about Eliza constantly. What had she gone through? What had driven her to that final decision, to put her son on a plane alone, carrying only a letter and a memory? She had always been strong, sharp, unwilling to be pitted or caged. She had loved fiercely, and he had once believed that would last forever, until he let ambition drown out everything else. Now all he had was the son she left behind, and the guilt that maybe, if he had stayed, things would have been different. But guilt wasn't useful anymore. Thomas didn't need apologies. He needed presence. Stability. Patience. Love. Henry didn't know how to be a father. Not really. But he knew how to stay. And that, he was beginning to realize, was more than enough to start with. The next day, he called the attorney handling the emergency guardianship process. He didn't want temporary custody. He wanted it permanent. He wanted every signature, every form, every evaluation needed to make it official. There were court dates to schedule, documents to file, a DNA test to confirm what his heart already knew. He'd go through all of it. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. When he came home that evening, Thomas ran to him with a drawing clutched in one hand. It was crude, drawn in thick crayon lines, but unmistakable. A tall man holding the hand of a small boy beneath a crooked sun. Above them, in uneven letters, was written one word, Dad. Henry knelt down, took the picture, and looked at Thomas. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just pulled the boy into a gentle hug, not too tight, but close enough to feel how real he was. That night, when the house finally grew quiet, Henry stood by the door of Thomas's room and watched him sleep. He didn't feel lost anymore. He didn't feel unsure. He felt chosen. And that changed everything. By the fourth week, the house no longer felt like a place Henry had returned to, it felt like a place being rewritten, one memory at a time. The silence that once echoed through the halls was now filled with footsteps too small to be heard unless you were listening closely. Thomas had taken to singing softly to himself in the mornings, a series of made-up tunes that always changed but somehow made perfect sense to him. The house, once a monument to a life of order and ambition, now bore signs of imperfection that Henry found strangely comforting: a sock under the coffee table, fingerprints on the glass doors, a crayon drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet that used to hold tax forms. Henry was learning how to adjust, not in grand gestures, but in 100 tiny, humbling ways. He had learned that Thomas hated the smell of eggs and loved apples with the skin peeled. He knew the boy needed 2 stories before bed, no matter how tired he was. He knew Thomas was afraid of loud toilets and that he would only wear pajamas with animals on them. He also knew that the nightmares came twice a week, always just before midnight, and that the boy would call for him softly, unsure if it was okay to wake him. Henry never hesitated. He would come into the room, sit on the edge of the bed, and rub his back until the fear melted away. There were no speeches, no explanations. Just presence. And slowly, that presence was becoming something Thomas could rely on. During the days, Henry began to navigate the unfamiliar world of early childhood. He enrolled Thomas in a local preschool under a temporary guardianship agreement and met with teachers who asked him about routines, favorite toys, food allergies, emotional triggers. He answered as best he could, filled out forms he never imagined completing, and sat through orientation meetings where he was just another parent in a room full of people balancing snacks and toddlers and exhaustion. And surprisingly, he didn't feel out of place. He felt human. Grounded. He had spent years at the top of skyscrapers, giving speeches about vision and strategy, but here, among sticky tables and alphabet charts, he felt closer to something real than he ever had in his glass office. The case with social services moved forward. The DNA test came back, confirmation of paternity, though Henry hadn't needed proof. The official custody process had begun, and while it might take weeks or months to finalize, no one questioned his commitment. The system, cautious as it was, recognized when someone showed up not for obligation but because they refused to leave. Amber, the social worker assigned to their case, was young but sharp, with kind eyes and a steady voice. She visited often to check on Thomas, but also on Henry. She asked about routines, about emotional bonding, about Henry's long-term plans. At first, he gave calculated answers, logical, structured, well-reasoned. But as time passed, his answers changed. He spoke not about plans, but about moments. About how Thomas hugged him tighter every week. About how bedtime had become his favorite part of the day. About how the boy had begun calling him Dad without hesitation. Amber listened, took notes, and once, after a particularly quiet visit, said something that stayed with him: sometimes, love doesn't need a timeline. It just needs proof that you're still there. Henry carried those words with him. They reminded him that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be consistent. When Thomas cried over broken toys, he didn't try to fix them right away. He listened first. When the boy laughed too loudly in restaurants, he didn't hush him. He laughed too. When Thomas asked why his mommy couldn't come back, Henry didn't offer false hope. He held him and told the truth, that she had loved him, that she had done her best, and that now, it was Henry's job to make sure he never had to feel that alone again. One night, after Thomas had fallen asleep with his arms wrapped around a toy firetruck, Henry sat in the living room with a cup of tea, looking through old photos he had dug out of a forgotten box in the attic. Most were of his childhood, his mother, a few blurry shots of Eliza. In one photo, she was sitting in the grass, barefoot, her eyes closed, sunlight on her face. He stared at it for a long time, guilt and love mingling in a way that made his chest ache. He whispered a thank you he knew she would never hear. Not just for Thomas, but for trusting him, even after everything. As the fire crackled and the house settled into night, Henry realized he no longer felt like a man pausing his life for someone else. He wasn't on a break from success. He wasn't waiting to return to what he had lost. He was building something new. Something that didn't need applause, only love. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Winter crept in slowly, wrapping the town in early darkness and cold mornings that required extra blankets and gloves too small for Henry to figure out without help. Life had found a rhythm now, and while it was far from easy, it was no longer unfamiliar. Thomas had started calling the house our place, and each time he said it, Henry felt something shift quietly inside him, like the foundation of his life was settling into place for the first time. The days were filled with school drop-offs, grocery runs, bedtime routines, and small miracles, a laugh after a tantrum, a picture drawn with "Dad" written at the top, the soft weight of a child falling asleep against his chest during a movie he hadn't planned to watch. One gray morning, while Henry was helping Thomas zip up his jacket, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. Very few people knew where they lived now, and Henry had intentionally kept it that way. When he opened the door, he was met with a woman in a long black coat, her expression professional but unreadable. She introduced herself as Rachel Myers, a lawyer representing a man named Curtis, Eliza's former partner, someone Henry had never met but had heard about in vague, uncomfortable tones. Rachel handed Henry an envelope containing legal documents. Curtis was filing a petition. He wanted joint custody of Thomas, claiming he had played a parental role in the boy's early life and had the right to continue doing so. Henry's entire body went still. He thanked her without emotion, closed the door, and locked it behind him, as if that simple gesture could keep the outside world from coming in. He read the documents slowly, twice, then a third time. The words felt sharp and clinical, filled with accusations that boiled down to one thing: doubt. Curtis claimed Henry had no real connection to Thomas, that he had shown up late, that his motivation was rooted in guilt, not love. The petition painted a version of the story Henry didn't recognize, one where he was a stranger to his son, where the bond they had built was nothing more than a temporary solution to a tragic inconvenience. Henry didn't tell Thomas. He didn't know how. The boy was still too young to understand the machinery of the legal system, too young to grasp the idea that someone might try to take him away. But Henry understood. He knew the courts would ask questions. They would examine his life, his decisions, his past. They would look for weakness, for gaps in consistency, for signs that he wasn't ready, that he wasn't enough. The next few days felt heavier. Thomas noticed the tension even if he didn't understand it. He started waking up more at night, asking if Henry would still be there in the morning. He drew pictures with darker colors. His questions became more pointed: why don't I have a mom anymore? Why do other kids have two houses? Henry answered as honestly as he could without unraveling. He told Thomas that not all families looked the same, but that didn't make them any less real. He told him that love was not about matching stories, it was about showing up every day, no matter what. Henry called Amber, the social worker, and they met in the dining room while Thomas was at school. She listened as he explained everything, her brow furrowed, her hands calm around a mug of tea. When he finished, she sighed and said, "Custody battles like this aren't uncommon, but they're always hard. You've done everything right so far, but the courts won't just look at that. They'll look at the past. They'll ask why you weren't there before." Henry nodded. "Because I didn't know. And now that I do, I'm not leaving." Amber didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Then keep showing them that. Not just the court, Thomas too." With her guidance, Henry gathered everything. Photos. School records. Letters from teachers. Notes from Thomas. Even the drawing that still hung on the refrigerator. He submitted character references. He met with child psychologists. He told his story without embellishment, just truth. The hearing was scheduled for mid-December. As the date approached, Henry found himself slowing down in the evenings. He would sit longer with Thomas after bedtime stories, run his fingers through the boy's hair, and memorize the shape of his breathing. He stopped checking his email entirely. The only schedule he followed was the one that revolved around school lunches and morning hugs. One night, while they sat on the couch watching a holiday cartoon, Thomas looked up and said, "If they make me go away, can I come back anyway?" Henry's heart cracked clean down the middle. He took the boy into his arms, held him tight, and whispered, "No one is taking you away. Not while I'm here." And he meant it. Every word. Because love, Henry had come to learn, was not always enough to stop pain. But it was enough to stand in front of it, hold the line, and refuse to let it win. The courthouse was gray and quiet on the morning of the hearing. Snow had started falling just before dawn, blanketing the streets in a thin, untouched layer that seemed to slow everything down. Henry arrived early, dressed in a dark suit that felt heavier than it used to, not because of the fabric, but because of the weight of everything it represented now. He wasn't here as a CEO or a public figure. He was here as a father, one who had spent every day for the last 2 months building something out of nothing, learning how to love a child who had been a stranger to him, and trying to become someone that child could count on without question. Amber met him at the entrance. She had a folder tucked under one arm and a tired but reassuring look in her eyes. They walked through the halls together in silence until they reached the family courtroom, a modest space with worn benches and soft lighting that felt more like a waiting room than a battlefield. On the far side of the room sat Curtis, the man who had filed the petition. He was taller than Henry expected, dressed well, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge Henry. He just sat beside his lawyer, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The judge entered shortly after and asked for both sides to present their cases. Curtis's lawyer went first, reading from a prepared statement filled with vague but pointed claims. He painted Curtis as a long-time emotional presence in Thomas's life, someone who had stepped in when no one else did. He spoke of Eliza with respect, but also as someone overwhelmed by her circumstances. He implied that Henry had stepped in only when things became convenient and that his relationship with Thomas, though well-meaning, lacked foundation. Henry listened without interrupting. He didn't flinch when the lawyer described him as emotionally unavailable, or when he questioned the sincerity of Henry's motives. He had prepared for this. He had expected it. And when it was his turn to speak, he didn't read from a statement. He stood, looked directly at the judge, and spoke from the place where all of this had begun. He told the truth. He told them how he hadn't known Thomas existed until the moment he saw him on that plane. How the boy had been left with nothing but a note and his name. How he had taken him home not out of guilt or responsibility, but out of something deeper, something he didn't have words for then but understood now, instinct, connection, the overwhelming feeling that this child belonged to him, not because of blood, but because of the bond that had formed in the weeks since. He talked about bedtime routines and scraped knees, about early mornings filled with cereal and coloring books, about the way Thomas had started calling him Dad without ever being asked to. He didn't cry, though his voice caught once, when he said, "This isn't something I'm doing for Thomas. This is something we're building together. Every single day. He's not my obligation. He's my son." After his testimony, Amber presented her report. She spoke of Thomas's progress, of the emotional stability he had gained, of the strength of the relationship she had observed between them. She referenced the letters from Thomas's teachers, the consistent involvement in his life, and the way Henry had chosen to change the course of his entire world just to stay close to one little boy. The psychologist echoed her report, noting that removing Thomas from Henry's care at this stage would likely cause more harm than any possible benefit. The judge asked a few final questions, then called a short recess. Henry stepped outside into the hallway, leaning against the wall near a vending machine that flickered weakly in the corner. He felt empty, not from fatigue, but from the emotional cost of having to prove something he already knew in his bones. He wanted to be back home. He wanted to pick up Thomas from school and take him to the park and read him the same story 3 times in a row just because he asked. He didn't want to fight anymore. He just wanted to live. When the court reconvened, the judge returned with her ruling. Her tone was measured, but her words were clear. Curtis's petition was denied. Legal custody would remain with Henry, and the court recognized him as the primary guardian with full parental rights. There was no applause. No dramatic moment of celebration. Just quiet stillness and the sound of Henry releasing a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Later that day, when he picked Thomas up from school, the boy ran toward him with the same unfiltered joy he always had. Henry knelt, caught him mid-run, and held him close, letting the cold air sting his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't explain what had happened in court. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Let's go home." And Thomas, smiling wide and warm against his shoulder, whispered back, "Our home." That was all that mattered. The weeks that followed the custody ruling felt like stepping into a new season of life, one Henry hadn't known he was waiting for. The tension that had quietly lived beneath the surface of every moment was finally gone. No more court dates. No more paperwork. No more watching every move with the fear that someone would question whether he belonged in his son's life. What remained was routine, not the kind dictated by business calendars and global meetings, but the kind made up of school pickups, spilled juice, bedtime laughter, and tiny socks that never stayed in pairs no matter how often he tried to organize them. Thomas had begun to change too. The fear in his eyes, the caution in his tone, the slight flinch when someone raised their voice, all of it began to fade. He smiled more, talked more, asked more questions. He had started drawing daily, pictures of their house, of the two of them holding hands, of rockets and dogs and sometimes things he couldn't explain but always called ours. Henry kept every one, taping them to the walls, the fridge, even the mirror in the hallway, until their home felt less like a restored memory and more like a living scrapbook of a boy reclaiming his childhood. Amber visited one last time for a final check-in. She walked through the house slowly, noting how Thomas clung to Henry's leg in a playful way, how naturally he moved through the space, how he pointed to his own room as "my spot" with a pride that was impossible to fake. She sat down with Henry in the kitchen after Thomas had gone outside to chase leaves in the wind and told him simply, "You did it." Not because the court said so, but because he did. He trusts you. And that's all the proof that ever mattered. Henry didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to praise that felt so personal. But Amber wasn't the type to linger. She left him with a signed document and a smile that didn't need words. That night, Henry made spaghetti from scratch for the first time. It was messy, wildly uneven, and Thomas declared it, kinda weird but still yummy. They ate sitting on the floor of the living room because the table was covered in Lego creations they had both agreed were too important to move. After dinner, they built a blanket fort. It wasn't very sturdy, and Henry bumped his head twice, but they read books inside it until Thomas fell asleep against his chest, breathing softly, fingers still tangled in the edge of Henry's shirt like a child who finally knew he was safe. In the quiet of that moment, Henry looked around at the chaos of pillows, books, and mismatched blankets, and realized he no longer missed the skyline view from his penthouse. He no longer felt the urge to check stock reports or performance projections. He didn't crave the approval of investors or the thrill of closing another impossible deal. He had traded all of that for something far simpler and infinitely more profound, a life made up of presence, of shared moments, of unconditional love offered without expectation. He thought of Eliza more gently now. Not with guilt, but with gratitude. She had made the hardest decision of her life to ensure that Thomas had a chance. And somewhere deep in his bones, Henry believed she would have been proud of how it turned out. Not because he had done everything right, but because he hadn't run. Because he had stayed. As winter melted into early spring, Henry and Thomas began walking to school instead of driving. They talked about everything and nothing, about frogs and clouds and whether cereal should be cold or hot. On weekends, they worked on the backyard together, planting tiny seedlings that Thomas insisted would grow into trees taller than the house. Henry didn't argue. He let the boy believe in magic because, for the first time in his life, he kind of believed in it too. He was still learning how to be a father. There were mistakes, impatience, moments when he questioned himself. But there was no more doubt about whether he belonged in this life. He did. And every day, Thomas showed him that being a parent wasn't about doing it all perfectly. It was about being the one who stays, who listens, who shows up again and again. And Henry, a man who had once built towers out of steel and glass, was now building something even stronger, one bedtime story, one school project, one whispered, "I love you," at a time. Spring arrived quietly, with rain that soaked the streets and small bursts of green pushing up through the earth like promises. The world outside was waking up again, but inside Henry's home, it felt like something had already bloomed. There was a calmness in the way the mornings began now, a rhythm to the life they'd created that no longer felt temporary or fragile. It was real. Thomas had stopped asking questions like, "Will I stay here?" or "Are you leaving?" Instead, he talked about summer plans and whether they could build a treehouse, if maybe they could get a dog, and if Henry would come to his school talent show even if he didn't win anything. Henry said yes to all of it. They no longer needed the nightlight. Thomas no longer needed the lullabies whispered at midnight to fall back asleep. But sometimes, Henry still sat beside his bed, not because the boy needed it, but because he did. He had once feared he wouldn't know how to love someone unconditionally, that the years he had spent living for ambition had made him too hard, too distant, too unfit for something as soft and pure as fatherhood. But now, as he watched Thomas grow, taller, more confident, filled with opinions and imagination, he understood that love had reshaped him entirely. It had reached places no success ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Henry received a letter in the mail, one that caught him off guard. It was handwritten, postmarked from a small town he didn't recognize. Inside was a note from Eliza's sister, someone he had never met. The letter wasn't long. It simply said, "I don't know what happened between you and Eliza. She never talked much about the past. But I do know she loved that boy more than anything, and that she made the hardest choice a mother ever could. I think she'd want you to know that she hoped you'd find each other. Thank you for not turning away." Henry sat with that letter for a long time. He hadn't realized how much he needed that small piece of grace, from someone who had known Eliza when he hadn't. It didn't change what had happened, and it didn't ease the ache that sometimes still settled in his chest when he thought of her. But it gave him something else, closure, or at least a kind of peace. Later that day, Thomas found him sitting alone in the kitchen, the letter folded on the table. The boy climbed into his lap and, without asking what was wrong, wrapped his arms around Henry's neck. They stayed like that for a while. No questions, no explanations. Just a father and a son, holding each other in the quiet certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. That evening, Henry cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, Thomas's favorite. They ate on the porch, watching the rain taper off into a light drizzle. Thomas asked if they could go somewhere together in the summer, maybe a beach or a mountain or even just a cabin in the woods. He didn't care where, as long as it was with Henry. And Henry promised they would, that they'd go anywhere he wanted. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the time. Before bed, Thomas handed Henry a new drawing. This one had more detail than usual, trees, a swing, a little red house with a sun above it. Two figures stood in front, one tall, one small. Both smiling. Above them, in blocky crayon letters, were the words, "Our beginning." Henry hung it next to the others. He no longer thought about the life he used to live, not with longing, not even with regret. That life had ended the moment he saw a crying child in seat 13A, holding a letter with his name on it. Everything that came after that wasn't a detour. It was the real path, the one he hadn't known existed. Now, he didn't wake up chasing deadlines. He woke up to little feet on the stairs, to sleepy voices asking for pancakes, to a life that was quieter, smaller, but infinitely more full. He had once believed that his legacy would be the buildings he left behind, the empire he built from nothing. But as he stood in Thomas's doorway that night, watching the boy drift to sleep with peace on his face and crayons still scattered across the bed, he realized that this was the only legacy that mattered. And in the deepest part of him, Henry knew he hadn't just saved Thomas. Thomas had saved him too. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is how quietly it speaks. It doesn't need a grand twist or a dramatic climax, because the real transformation happens slowly, through presence, patience, and love. Henry's journey from detached executive to devoted father is not only believable, it's deeply moving. It shows that healing doesn't come from fixing the past, but from choosing to show up fully in the present. The most touching part, for me, is how the story honors both the child's innocence and the adult's capacity for change. Thomas isn't just a symbol of redemption, he's a whole person who teaches Henry how to be human again. And Henry, despite his flaws and late start, earns something money could never buy: trust, connection, and the right to be called Dad. It's a reminder that the most meaningful legacies aren't built in boardrooms or measured in billions. They're built in bedtime stories, kitchen table drawings, and the quiet promise to never walk away. Ethan Holden had built his life around control. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every outcome predicted. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he pulled a drowning little girl from the pool, only to look into her wide, terrified blue eyes and see his own staring back at him. Ethan Holden had attended more corporate events and exclusive gatherings than he could count. They all blurred together, the same luxury venues, the same perfectly curated guest lists, the same surface-level conversations about stocks, market trends, and investments. Tonight was no different. A private charity gala at an upscale country club, where business moguls and socialites sipped expensive champagne and made carefully veiled deals over gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Ethan was used to it. He thrived in these circles. But as he stood near the pool, casually listening to a partner discuss an upcoming merger, his mind was elsewhere. The evening was warm, and the soft glow of lanterns reflected off the water, giving everything an almost surreal golden hue. The rhythmic chatter of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the distant hum of a jazz band, it was all background noise. He had learned to tune it out long ago. He was about to excuse himself and step away for a moment of fresh air when something cut through the comfortable monotony of the evening. A sharp, panicked scream. It took him a second to process the sound. Then another second to register where it had come from. His gaze snapped toward the pool just as a splash sent water rippling outward. The people around him turned, some gasping, others frozen in shock. In the deep end of the pool, a small child was struggling. Her tiny hands clawed at the surface, her mouth open in a silent cry, her golden blonde hair fanning out in the water. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. For a second, no one moved. It was as if the entire gathering had collectively forgotten how to react. A woman let out a strangled cry, but she didn't move forward. Others just stood there, stunned, waiting for someone else to act. Ethan didn't wait. He was already moving. His jacket hit the ground as he rushed forward, and without hesitation, he dove into the pool. The cold water engulfed him instantly, but his body moved on instinct. He pushed forward, reaching the girl just as she slipped under. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her upward as he kicked hard toward the surface. When they broke through the water, she was coughing, gasping, her small fingers gripping his shirt in desperation. "I've got you," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You're okay." He held her securely as he swam toward the edge of the pool. Strong hands reached down, someone finally reacting, and helped lift her out of the water. Ethan followed, hoisting himself onto the deck, water dripping from his clothes as he knelt beside her. The girl was trembling, her breaths coming in short gasps. Her blue eyes, strikingly bright even in the dim evening light, were wide with shock. A second later, a woman pushed through the gathered crowd, her heels clattering against the stone pavement as she rushed toward them. "Emmy! Oh my God, baby." Ethan barely had time to register the name before the woman dropped to her knees beside the little girl. Her hands shook as she cupped the child's face, brushing wet strands of hair away with frantic, tender movements. The girl, Emmy, blinked up at her, her breathing still uneven. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice small and shaky. "The man saved me." Ethan looked up at the mother, ready to reassure her that Emmy was going to be fine. But the words died in his throat the moment their eyes met. "Cassie." His entire body went still. For a second, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But there was no mistaking her. Even after 6 years, she looked exactly the same. Dark brown hair that framed her face, deep brown eyes filled with panic and relief, the same expression she used to have when she was trying to hide her emotions but failing miserably. His pulse thundered in his ears as realization hit him like a wrecking ball. Emmy. Cassie's daughter. Cassie's daughter with blonde hair. Cassie's daughter with his blue eyes. His mouth felt dry as he stared at the little girl again, his mind racing so fast he could barely keep up. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. And yet, the resemblance was undeniable. Cassie seemed to realize it at the same time he did. Her entire body tensed, her breath hitching, as though she had just been caught in a lie she had been keeping for years. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ethan forced himself to swallow, to push through the storm of emotions crashing over him. He had to be sure. "Cassie," his voice was rough, almost unrecognizable to himself. "Is she?" She shot up to her feet, suddenly on high alert. "No," she said too quickly, shaking her head. "No. Thank you for helping her, Ethan. I appreciate it. But we have to go." She bent down, scooping Emmy into her arms. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, still shaken but no longer crying. Ethan stood, his muscles tense, his mind screaming at him to stop her. He couldn't let her just walk away. Not this time. Not without answers. "Wait," he said sharply. "Cassie, stop." She hesitated, but only for a second. Then she turned away. "Cassie." His voice was louder now, demanding. He took a step forward, his heart pounding. "Tell me the truth. Is she my daughter?" She froze. The crowd was silent around them, but Ethan barely noticed. He could see it in her posture, in the way her fingers curled protectively around Emmy's back, in the way she refused to look at him. That was all the answer he needed. Cassie took a deep breath, then finally turned her head slightly, just enough to whisper the one word that changed everything. "Goodbye, Ethan." And then she walked away. Ethan stood there, his clothes still soaked, water dripping onto the stone pavement beneath him, but he barely noticed. His pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Cassie disappear into the crowd, Emmy still wrapped tightly in her arms. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like a crushing force. He had just saved a little girl from drowning, and now, in the span of a few minutes, he had been hit with the impossible realization that she might be his daughter. The logical part of his brain demanded answers. It screamed at him to chase after Cassie, to force her to tell him the truth, to demand why she had kept this from him. But his body refused to move. He was still processing the shock, his mind racing through every possibility, every memory, every moment from 6 years ago that could explain how he had a child he had never known about. He had spent years wondering why Cassie left. One day, she had been there, the woman he thought he was going to marry, the only person who had ever made him think about a future outside of his career. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. No explanations, no fights, no warning, just a short note saying she was sorry and that it was for the best. He had looked for her, tried to understand, but eventually, he had convinced himself that she had simply chosen a different life. Now he knew that wasn't the truth. A hand landed on his shoulder, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to see one of his business partners, Ryan, looking at him with concern. "Hey, man. You okay?" That was intense. Ethan blinked, forcing himself to nod. "Yeah. I'm fine." Ryan studied him for a second before lowering his voice. "You know her?" Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "And the kid?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he said, and the weight of those words nearly crushed him. He didn't wait for Ryan's response. He turned and walked away, his mind already forming a plan. He needed to find Cassie. He needed to hear the truth from her own lips. The next morning, Ethan was at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, his fingers tapping against the surface as he waited for a search to load. He had barely slept. The moment he got home the night before, he had started looking for her. He had connections, resources, access to the kind of information most people couldn't get their hands on. It hadn't taken long to track her down. Cassie Brooks. Senior editor at a small publishing house in the city. She had been living in New York for 3 years. 3 years. That meant she had moved here long before their paths had accidentally crossed at the gala. Which also meant she had never intended for him to find out about Emmy. The thought made his stomach twist. He grabbed his phone, staring at the number he had found for her. He could call. He could demand answers right now. But something told him she wouldn't pick up. She had been running from him for years. Why would she stop now? No, he needed to do this in person. Less than an hour later, Ethan was stepping into the quiet, cozy office of the publishing house where Cassie worked. It was a far cry from the corporate skyscrapers he was used to, smaller, more personal, filled with bookshelves and framed quotes about storytelling. It suited her. A receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Cassie Brooks," he said. "Is she available?" The woman hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" Ethan forced a polite smile. "It's personal. She'll want to see me." The receptionist still looked unsure, but she nodded and picked up the phone. A moment later, she gestured toward a hallway. "Second office on the left." Ethan thanked her and walked toward the door. He didn't knock. He stepped inside and found Cassie sitting at her desk, a pen in her hand, her brows furrowed as she reviewed a manuscript. She looked up. The moment her eyes met his, he saw the flicker of panic. "Ethan," she breathed, setting down the pen. "What are you doing here?" He closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." Cassie exhaled, already shaking her head. "Ethan, Is she mine?" The words came out sharp, cutting straight through whatever excuse she had been about to make. "Tell me the truth, Cassie. Is Emmy my daughter?" She closed her eyes for a second, as if bracing herself, then looked at him again. He saw the battle in her expression, the part of her that wanted to keep running, and the part of her that knew she couldn't anymore. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan felt his breath catch. He had known it. He had seen it in Emmy's eyes. But hearing it out loud was different. It sent a wave of emotions crashing over him, anger, betrayal, shock, something dangerously close to heartbreak. "Why?" His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "Why did you keep her from me?" Cassie swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her desk. "Because you had your whole life planned out, Ethan. Your career, your ambitions, there was no room for a baby. I knew if I told you, you'd feel obligated to stay, and I couldn't do that to you." His hands clenched into fists. "That wasn't your choice to make." She let out a shaky breath. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" His voice rose slightly. "You took away 4 years, Cassie. 4 years of my daughter's life." Do you have any idea what that feels like? Tears welled in her eyes. I do, she whispered. I've regretted it every day. Ethan stared at her, his heart pounding. He wanted to be furious. He wanted to yell, to demand why she had stolen those years from him. But more than anything, he wanted to know his daughter. I want to see her, he said, his voice firm. I want to be in her life. Cassie hesitated. Ethan, No, he cut her off. No more running. No more excuses. I lost 4 years. I'm not losing another day. Cassie wiped at her eyes, her expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. One day, she said quietly. We'll start with one day. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. Ethan had always been a man who took control of every situation. He built his empire from the ground up by making bold decisions, by never hesitating, by always knowing his next move before anyone else did. But as he stood in front of Cassie's apartment door the next morning, waiting for her to open it, he realized this was the first time in his life that he had no idea what to expect. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with the same thoughts, the same unanswered questions. What had Emmy's first word been? What had she looked like when she took her first steps? What kind of things made her laugh? He had missed all of it, for years of moments he would never get back, and the weight of that loss settled in his chest like a lead anchor. The door opened, and there she was. Cassie looked tired, as if she hadn't slept much either. She was dressed casually in jeans and a soft sweater, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. There was hesitation in her eyes, but also resignation. She had agreed to this, and now there was no turning back. She's in the living room, Cassie said softly, stepping aside. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and walked in. The apartment was warm and inviting, nothing like the cold, modern spaces he was used to. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with colorful children's books mixed with Cassie's own collection. A few framed drawings, clearly made by small hands, were taped to the fridge. The scent of something sweet lingered in the air, as if cookies had been baked recently. And then he saw her. Emmy was sitting on the floor, her small legs crossed as she carefully stacked wooden blocks into a tiny castle. Her golden blonde hair fell in soft waves around her face, and her bright blue eyes, his blue eyes, were focused with deep concentration. She hadn't noticed him yet. Ethan felt his breath hitch. She was so small. So delicate. And yet, there was something familiar in the way she furrowed her brow in determination, something that sent a strange mix of warmth and heartbreak through him. Cassie cleared her throat. Emmy, sweetheart. The little girl looked up, her expression curious. Cassie gave her a gentle smile. Remember how I told you someone special was coming to visit today? Emmy's gaze shifted to Ethan. She studied him with an intensity that caught him off guard, as if she was trying to figure out exactly who he was before deciding what to do next. Then, to his utter surprise, she tilted her head and said, "You're the man who saved me." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "That was me." Emmy blinked, considering this. Then she looked at Cassie. "Mommy said you know us." Ethan forced himself to stay calm, to let Cassie lead the conversation. He knew this wasn't something that could be rushed. "I do," he said carefully. "I've known your mommy for a long time." Emmy stared at him for another moment before nodding, as if deciding that this answer was acceptable. Then, completely unfazed, she patted the floor next to her. "Do you want to help me build?" Ethan hesitated only a second before moving forward and lowering himself to the floor. He was still in his usual dress shirt and slacks, but he didn't care. If his daughter wanted him to build a castle, then that's exactly what he was going to do. "What are we building?" he asked, reaching for a block. A princess castle, Emmy announced proudly. But it needs to be really big. Ethan smiled. Got it. Biggest castle ever. Cassie sat on the couch, watching them, her expression unreadable. Ethan knew this wasn't easy for her. She had spent years raising Emmy alone, protecting her, keeping this world separate from the one he had lived in. Now, in a matter of days, that wall was crumbling. For the next hour, Ethan let Emmy take charge, following her instructions as they carefully stacked blocks into a towering structure. She was full of energy, talking non-stop about her favorite books, her best friend at preschool, the pink bicycle she was hoping to get for her next birthday. He soaked in every word, committing every detail to memory. At one point, she looked up at him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you have kids?" The question caught him off guard. "No," he said carefully. "Just you." Emmy blinked. "Oh," she said simply, as if filing that information away for later. Then she smiled. "That's good. You can help me with my castle more." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Sounds like a deal." After a while, Cassie stood. "Lunch time," she said. "Emmy, go wash your hands." The little girl scrambled to her feet and ran off down the hall. Ethan watched her go, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Cassie exhaled, rubbing her temples. "That went better than I expected." Ethan turned to her. "She's incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Cassie's gaze softened. "She is." He hesitated before speaking again. "Cassie. I need to be in her life. I don't know how yet, but I need to figure it out." Cassie was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time." It wasn't a perfect answer. But for now, it was enough. Ethan had never been good at waiting. He was used to immediate results, to making a decision and watching it unfold exactly the way he planned. That was how he had built his career, how he had climbed to the top while others hesitated. But this, earning a place in his daughter's life, wasn't something that could be rushed. Cassie had made that clear when she told him they would take things one step at a time, and as much as it frustrated him, he knew she was right. Over the next few weeks, he spent as much time with Emmy as Cassie allowed. It started with short visits, an hour at the park, lunch at a small cafe, sitting on the floor of Cassie's apartment helping Emmy put together puzzles. Every time he saw her, he learned something new. She hated peas but loved strawberries. She had a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hop who had to sleep next to her every night. She liked to dance when she thought no one was watching. She was smart, funny, and stubborn in a way that reminded him so much of himself that it was almost unsettling. One afternoon, they sat together at a small table in a children's play area inside a bookstore. Emmy had a coloring book open in front of her, carefully filling in a picture of a princess while Ethan watched. He had never thought he would be the kind of man to sit in a bookstore with a 4-year-old, handing her different colored crayons while she debated which shade of pink was best, but now he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "Are you coming again tomorrow?" Emmy asked without looking up. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Cassie, who was sitting on a nearby bench with a cup of coffee in her hands. She had given him space with Emmy, but he could feel her listening. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said carefully. "That's up to your mom." Emmy finally looked at him, her blue eyes serious. "I think you should come." Ethan felt his heart squeeze. "I'd like that too," he admitted. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to coloring. Ethan glanced at Cassie again, and this time she met his eyes. There was something in her expression, hesitation, but also something softer, something that told him she was beginning to trust him. Later that evening, as they stood outside the bookstore, Ethan walked Cassie and Emmy to their car. Emmy was tired, her small hand wrapped around her mother's as she yawned. "Ethan," Cassie said quietly once Emmy was settled in her car seat. He turned to her, waiting. "You should come tomorrow." His chest tightened. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a step forward, a sign that she was finally letting him in. "I'll be there," he promised. As he watched them drive away, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work or deals or deadlines. He was thinking about bedtime stories, about small hands gripping his, about the way Emmy's eyes lit up when she saw him. He was thinking about the future. And this time, it wasn't just his own. Ethan arrived at Cassie's apartment the next afternoon, feeling something unfamiliar, a nervous energy that he wasn't used to. He had closed million-dollar deals without hesitation, faced down corporate sharks without blinking, but standing in front of Cassie's door, waiting for it to open, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the outcome. When the door opened, Cassie stood there, wearing a casual sweater and jeans, her dark brown eyes scanning his face as if trying to gauge whether she had made the right decision in inviting him over. She still wasn't sure about this. He could see it in the way she hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. "She's in her room," Cassie said softly, closing the door behind him. "She's been excited all day." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest at the thought. He was still getting used to the idea that someone so small could be waiting for him, that he was becoming an important part of someone's world in a way that had nothing to do with business or success. He followed Cassie down the hall, stopping in the doorway of a room that was unmistakably Emmy's. The walls were a soft pastel pink, decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars and drawings that looked like they had been made by small hands. A bookshelf filled with colorful storybooks stood against the wall, next to a small bed covered in a floral-patterned blanket. And there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was Emmy. She looked up the moment she saw him, her bright blue eyes lighting up. "You came," she said, scrambling to her feet. Ethan smiled. "Of course I did." Emmy grabbed his hand, tugging him toward a tiny plastic tea set arranged in the middle of the floor. "We're having a tea party," she announced. "You have to sit here." Ethan glanced at Cassie, who was standing by the doorway with her arms crossed, watching them. She didn't say anything, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. He lowered himself onto the floor, sitting awkwardly on the small rug as Emmy handed him a tiny pink teacup. "You have to pretend it's real," she instructed, lifting her own cup with exaggerated elegance. Ethan fought back a smile and mimicked her movements. "This is the best tea I've ever had," he said seriously. Emmy giggled. "It's not real, silly." Cassie let out a quiet laugh from where she stood, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt something shift in the air between them. He had spent so long being angry at her for keeping Emmy a secret, but now, watching the way she looked at their daughter, he realized something. She hadn't done it to hurt him. She had done it to protect Emmy, to give her a stable life without the chaos that came with his world. He still wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive her, but for the first time, he understood. They spent the afternoon playing in Emmy's room. She showed him every stuffed animal she owned, made him color in one of her books, and even insisted on reading him a story, even though she stumbled over some of the bigger words. Ethan listened intently, memorizing every little thing about her. At some point, Emmy climbed onto his lap, settling against him as she flipped through another book. Ethan barely breathed, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever magic was happening. He had spent years believing that he wasn't the kind of man meant for family life, that his world was too fast-paced, too demanding. But right now, sitting on the floor of his daughter's bedroom, with her small hands resting on his arm, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt home. Cassie must have sensed it too, because when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "She likes you." Ethan looked up at her. "Yeah." Cassie nodded. "She doesn't warm up to people easily. But with you, It's like she's known you forever. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling something tighten in his chest. I want to be here, Cassie. For her. Cassie held his gaze for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. I know. For the first time since he had found out about Emmy, she wasn't fighting him. She wasn't trying to push him away. And for the first time, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at being something more than just fragments of a broken past. Maybe they had a chance at being a family. Ethan had always thought that success was measured in numbers. The size of his company, the value of his investments, the deals he closed, these were the things that had defined him for years. But now, as he stood in Cassie's kitchen, watching Emmy carefully place stickers onto a sheet of paper with the same level of focus he once reserved for contract negotiations, he realized that success might look completely different than he had imagined. It had been 2 weeks since Cassie had let him into their lives, and in that time, he had come to understand just how much he had missed. He had thought he could step in and make up for lost time, but fatherhood wasn't something that could be built overnight. It was in the small moments, the way Emmy reached for his hand without thinking, the way she called his name excitedly when she saw him, the way she whispered "good night" when he left. Each moment felt like a step forward, a tiny piece of proof that he was slowly becoming part of her world. Tonight, Cassie had invited him over for dinner. It was a simple thing, something that should have felt casual, but to Ethan, it meant everything. Sitting at a dinner table with his daughter, eating a meal that wasn't catered or delivered to his office, was a kind of normalcy he had never imagined for himself. Emmy sat between them, happily chatting about her day at preschool while stabbing at her pasta with a fork that was far too big for her small hands. Cassie listened with a soft smile, occasionally glancing at Ethan as if trying to gauge his reaction to this new version of his life. She told her teacher today that she has 2 daddies, Cassie said suddenly, her voice laced with amusement. Ethan raised an eyebrow, looking at Emmy. Oh yeah? Emmy nodded, completely unfazed. I told them I have my daddy, Mr. Hop. Cassie laughed, shaking her head. Mr. Hop is her stuffed rabbit, in case you were wondering. Ethan chuckled, feeling some of the tension in his chest ease. Good to know I have competition. Emmy tilted her head, considering. You're bigger than Mr. Hop. And you saved me. So maybe you can be my real daddy, and he can just be my bedtime daddy. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to say it, to acknowledge him as something more than just a visitor in her life. He looked at Cassie, searching for her reaction, but she only watched Emmy with an unreadable expression. You sure about that, kiddo? He asked carefully. Emmy nodded. Yeah. Mr. Hop can't reach the top shelf, but you can. That's important. Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. That is very important. Cassie stood, gathering the empty plates and carrying them to the sink. Ethan instinctively moved to help, but she shook her head. I've got it. You should put her to bed. Ethan hesitated. Are you sure? Cassie nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I think she'd like that. Ethan turned to Emmy, who was already reaching for his hand. Come on, Daddy, she said, the word slipping out so naturally that it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. He followed her to her room, taking in the small details he hadn't noticed before. The books lined up perfectly on her shelf, the way her blankets were slightly rumpled from where she had probably jumped on them earlier, the tiny pair of shoes tucked neatly beside her dresser. It was a glimpse into the life he had missed, a reminder of how much he still had to learn. Emmy climbed into bed and grabbed Mr. Hop, hugging him tightly. Ethan sat beside her, unsure of what to do next. What happens now? He asked. You have to tuck me in, Emmy said as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ethan carefully pulled the blanket up to her chin, tucking it around her the way he had seen Cassie do. Emmy wiggled a little, getting comfortable, then looked up at him with sleepy blue eyes. You have to say it, she mumbled. Say what? The thing mommies and daddies say. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He leaned down, brushing a stray curl from her forehead, and whispered the words that suddenly meant more to him than anything else in the world. Good night, sweetheart. Emmy sighed contentedly, her eyes fluttering closed. Within seconds, her breathing evened out, and Ethan sat there for a long moment, just watching her. When he finally stood and walked out of the room, Cassie was waiting for him in the hallway. She loves you, she said softly. Ethan met her gaze. I love her too. Cassie exhaled, her expression conflicted. This isn't just about visits and playtime, Ethan. If you're really in this, it's for good. No walking away. No getting too busy. She doesn't deserve that. Ethan took a step closer, his voice firm. I don't walk away from the things that matter. And she's the most important thing in my life now. Cassie studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Okay, she whispered. Ethan knew there was still a long road ahead. But tonight, as he stood in Cassie's apartment, hearing Emmy's soft breathing from the other room, he realized something. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was home. Ethan never thought that something as simple as a bedtime routine could change his perspective on life. But every evening he spent with Emmy, reading her stories, tucking her in, and listening to her sleepy little voice ask him questions about his day, felt like another piece of himself falling into place. He had spent years believing that his success was measured by numbers, by business deals, by the expansion of his company. But now, he was starting to realize that true success might be measured in the way Emmy smiled when she saw him, in the way she reached for his hand without thinking, in the quiet, unspoken trust that was growing between them. Cassie had been hesitant at first, careful about how much time she let him spend with Emmy. But after weeks of proving himself, she had started to let down her guard. The visits became longer. Dinners became a routine. Ethan found himself more familiar with the layout of Cassie's apartment than he was with his own penthouse. His life had started shifting in ways he never anticipated, and for the first time, he wasn't resisting it. One evening, after Emmy had fallen asleep, Ethan sat in the living room with Cassie, a cup of coffee in his hands. She was curled up on the couch across from him, looking exhausted but content. He had noticed how hard she worked, how much she carried on her own, and he had started to wonder how she had managed all of it without him for so long. She really loves having you here, Cassie said, her voice quiet. Ethan looked up from his coffee, meeting her gaze. I love being here. Cassie hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through her hair. I never wanted to keep her from you, she admitted. I told myself I was doing the right thing. That I was protecting her. But the truth is, I was scared. I was scared you wouldn't want this. That you'd feel trapped. That one day, you'd decide this wasn't what you wanted and leave, and I couldn't let her go through that. Ethan set his coffee down, leaning forward. Cassie, I get why you did what you did. But I need you to hear me when I say that I'm not going anywhere. I missed too much already, and I won't let that happen again. She nodded slowly, but there was still something in her eyes, something unresolved. I believe you, she said. But this isn't just about Emmy. It's about us too. Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his face. I know. Cassie hesitated before continuing. We were good together once, she said softly. And then we weren't. I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Ethan studied her, taking in the way she looked at him, cautious, unsure, but not closed off. I don't want to go back, he said honestly. I want to move forward. With you. With Emmy. With whatever this is. Cassie looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of her sweater. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Ethan nodded, leaning back. Then we'll take it one step at a time. Just like we're doing with Emmy. Cassie looked at him again, and for the first time, he saw something in her expression that made his heart beat a little faster. Hope. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't dismiss it either. Instead, she gave him a small, almost shy smile. One step at a time. It wasn't everything. But it was a start. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ethan had always believed that happiness was something you had to earn, something that came only after years of work, sacrifice, and relentless ambition. He had spent most of his life chasing it in the form of success, in the endless pursuit of something bigger, something greater. But sitting in Cassie's apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, watching Emmy dance barefoot across the living room in her pajamas, he realized that happiness had been right here all along, in the moments he had never allowed himself to have. The past few months had changed everything. What had started as cautious, carefully scheduled visits had turned into something more natural, something real. He no longer felt like a guest in his daughter's life. He was part of it now, woven into the fabric of her days in a way that felt permanent. She no longer hesitated before reaching for his hand. She no longer looked to Cassie for reassurance when he was around. She trusted him, in the quiet, unconditional way that only children could. This morning, Cassie had made pancakes, and they had sat together at the small kitchen table, Emmy happily swinging her feet as she covered hers in syrup. Ethan had never been a breakfast person, had always rushed through his mornings, too focused on his schedule to care about things like pancakes or syrup-covered fingers. But today, he had let Emmy smear syrup across his plate as she tried to cut his pancakes for him, laughing when she got more on the table than on his fork. He had never known mornings could feel like this. After breakfast, Emmy had decided it was time for a dance party. She turned on music from one of her favorite cartoons and twirled across the room, holding her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hop, in one hand. Cassie sat beside Ethan on the couch, sipping her coffee, watching their daughter with a soft smile. "She does this every weekend," Cassie said, her voice warm with affection. "She says it's how she starts the day with good energy." Ethan chuckled. "That's a solid strategy." Emmy suddenly stopped mid-spin and turned to face them. "You have to dance too." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, do I?" Emmy nodded, hands on her hips, completely serious. "Yes. Mommy too. Family dance party." Ethan glanced at Cassie, who sighed dramatically before setting down her coffee. "Well, if it's a requirement." She stood, holding out a hand to Ethan. For a second, he hesitated, caught off guard by the gesture. It was such a small thing, but it felt like more. Slowly, he reached out, taking her hand as she pulled him to his feet. Emmy cheered, clapping her hands before grabbing each of them and spinning them in circles. Ethan wasn't sure when was the last time he had danced, let alone in the middle of a living room with a 4-year-old leading the way, but he found that he didn't care. Cassie was laughing, Emmy was beaming, and for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't thinking about work or the future or what came next. He was just here, in this moment, with them. When the song ended, Emmy collapsed onto the couch in a fit of giggles, and Cassie fell beside her, breathless from laughter. Ethan sat down next to them, feeling something settle inside him, something he hadn't even realized was still restless. Emmy climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. "That was the best dance party ever," she mumbled sleepily. Ethan smiled, wrapping an arm around her small frame. "Yeah, I think so too." Cassie watched them, something unreadable in her expression. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, Cassie said, "I think we're going to be okay." Ethan looked at her, his heart tightening in his chest. He had spent so much time wondering if he would ever get to this moment, if he would ever be more than just a visitor in their lives. And now, sitting here with Emmy curled against him and Cassie looking at him like maybe, just maybe, she was ready to believe in him again, he knew the answer. They already were. The ending of this story is more than just a resolution, it's a transformation. Ethan starts as a man who believes success is measured by power and wealth, but by the time the story ends, he realizes that true success is about love, connection, and the moments that can't be bought or planned. His journey isn't just about discovering he has a daughter, it's about proving he's worthy of being in her life, of making up for lost time, and of rebuilding trust with Cassie. What makes this ending satisfying is that it doesn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, it finds its power in the small, everyday moments, the family breakfast, the dance party, the quiet acknowledgement between two people who once lost each other but found their way back. Cassie's final words, "I think we're going to be okay," carry so much weight because they're not just about her and Ethan. They're about the family they've become, the second chances they've embraced, and the life they're finally building together. This story isn't just about romance or fatherhood, it's about redemption. It's about a man learning that being present matters more than being perfect. It's about a mother letting go of fear and a little girl who unknowingly heals the wounds of the past simply by existing. And in the end, it's about love, not the kind that's rushed or forced, but the kind that grows, step by step, until it becomes unshakable.